Speaking in tongues is a practice that has been observed in various Christian communities for centuries. It involves speaking in a language that is not known or understood by the speaker, and often interpreted as a form of communication with God. However, in recent times, there has been a growing debate about the interpretation of speaking in tongues, with some suggesting that the practice has strayed from its original meaning. One of the key arguments in this debate revolves around the role of interpreters in speaking in tongues. In this video, we will explore the history of speaking in tongues and what the Bible says about the use of interpreters. In the Christian context, speaking in tongues is often associated with the events described in the Bible's New Testament, specifically in the book of Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2. In this chapter, the disciples of Christ are gathered together on the day of Pentecost, and suddenly they began to speak in different languages that they had not previously known. The Bible describes speaking in tongues as a form of language. In the book of Acts of the Apostles, it is said that the disciples spoke in languages that were known to the people who heard them, even though the disciples had not previously known those languages. This suggests that speaking in tongues was not just some form of babbling, but a genuine form of communication. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 27 to 28, the Apostle Paul says that if someone speaks in tongues, there should be someone to interpret what they are saying. This suggests that the practice of speaking in tongues was not meant to be a private experience, but rather one that was meant to be shared and understood by others. The interpreter would be able to translate the speaker's words into a language that the listeners could understand, thereby allowing the message to be communicated effectively. Despite the clear emphasis on the use of interpreters in the Bible, there has been some controversy surrounding the practice in contemporary Christian communities. Some argue that the modern practice of speaking in tongues has strayed from its original purpose and has become a form of personal expression rather than a means of communicating with others. Others argue that interpreters are still necessary for speaking in tongues to be effective in conveying a message. Without an interpreter, the words spoken in tongues may be unclear to those who do not understand the language being spoken. In this way, the message of speaking in tongues may be lost or misinterpreted. The gift of interpretation of tongues is mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 10, which states, "To another, the working of miracles, to another, prophecy, to another, discerning of spirits, to another, diverse kinds of tongues, to another, the interpretation of tongues." This gift is distinct from the gift of speaking in tongues, and not everyone who speaks in tongues necessarily has the gift of interpretation. The lack of interpreters in today's churches may be due to several reasons. Firstly, not everyone has been gifted with the ability to interpret tongues. This means that even if there are people speaking in tongues in a church, there may not be anyone present who has the gift of interpretation. Secondly, some churches may not emphasize the need for interpretation of tongues or may interpret the practice differently. For instance, some churches may view speaking in tongues as a personal prayer language rather than a message meant to be shared with others. As such, the need for interpretation may not be as high a priority in such churches. The presence of interpretation may depend on the cultural and linguistic diversity of the church. If a church has a predominantly homogeneous group of people who speak the same language, then the need for interpretation may not be as high. However, if a church has a diverse group of people who speak different languages, then the need for interpretation may be higher. The lack of interpreters in today's churches does not necessarily mean that most people speaking in tongues are not genuine. Speaking in tongues is a personal experience, and the way it is practiced and interpreted can vary from one individual or church to another. It is important to note that the absence of an interpreter does not automatically mean that the message being conveyed is not genuine. Some speakers of tongues may not need interpretation, as they may be speaking in a language that is understood by the listeners. Additionally, some speakers of tongues may be conveying a message that is personal and not necessarily meant to be shared with others. It is also possible that interpreters are present but are not publicly acknowledged or recognized. The topic of speaking in tongues and interpretation of tongues is a complex and controversial issue within the realm of Christianity. While the Bible clearly mentions both speaking in tongues and the interpretation of tongues, their practice and interpretation can vary among different Christian denominations and communities. Some argue that speaking in tongues and the interpretation of tongues are essential components of the Christian faith, while others view them as secondary or even unnecessary. The lack of interpreters in some churches has led to questions about the authenticity of those speaking in tongues, but it is important to note that the presence or absence of an interpreter does not necessarily determine the genuineness of the speaker's message. Regardless of one's personal beliefs on the matter, it is important to approach the topic of speaking in tongues and interpretation of tongues with an open mind and respect for different interpretations and practices. Rather than judging or questioning the authenticity of others, we should focus on our own personal relationship with God and strive to live our lives in a way that aligns with our beliefs and values. I hope you found this video helpful. Please share your views with us in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you.